The snow stopped falling a few hours ago. What was once an overcrowded city is now a frozen wasteland. You can hardly distinguish the houses between them. The roofs are barely visible above the snow accumulating during the last month. The trees have already succumbed to the cold and the weight of the ice, while the animals have taken refuge with the humans inside houses and other buildings. The wild animals? I don't know. I never really thought about them. Some must have died already, I suppose. Others must be having a great time, like the polar bears. Or maybe these temperatures are too low even for them, and the temperature keeps falling. Nobody knows when it'll stop, or if it's even reversible. Nobody knows exactly how the whole world ended up this way. Of course, we all know the why, but not the how, because everything happened in such a strange way that nobody understands. All the physicists in the world tried to explain it, to solve it, but they couldn't. Now the entire population of Earth is in an underground bunker, those that have been built in case of nuclear war. They're the only places with enough insulation to resist low temperatures, at least for a while. Nobody knows exactly how much will survive. Everything will depend on the amount of provisions that each of us saved. I have enough for several years, of course. I wasn't going to build an anti-nuclear bunker and then not fuel it. The food may last me several decades, but I'm sure I can survive at least 5 years. Perhaps in that time the Earth will warm up again, or the cold will kill me. Anyway, I guess the food will do. In addition, I have the perfect entertainment set, which is also not dependent on the internet, because the internet no longer works. It's been down for several weeks. Same with telephone communication, TVs, and even the radio, which was the last to fall, just 2 decades ago. Everyone knows that if the radios stop working, it's only a matter of time before the temperature would drop so low that it would cause flash freezing. The last words heard were, "Please, survive." I've no idea who said them. The president, maybe, or some scientist trying to encourage himself or others, probably hoping that given the time they have, they'll find some resolution. It was as if he was saying, "Please survive," so someone is there to see that we succeeded. Or, "Please survive so that we don't take the blame for humanity's extinction." The reality is, it really was the fault of the scientists. Or at least, that's what we believe. Because once again, nobody knows exactly what happened. Teleportation. That was the great invention that they were testing. The first teleportation machine in history. The theory was perfect. The machine had been built following the instructions to the letter. Everything had been checked at least 10 times. The task was, in theory, simple. Transporting a cardboard box from point A to point B. At both points, one of the machine halves was located, the transmitter and the receiver. The distance wasn't very far, barely 2 meters. It was the first attempt, after all. They couldn't ask much of it. The cardboard box was placed on the transmitter, right in the middle of the small circular platform that made it up. A protective bubble was placed on top of the box and fitted perfectly into the platform. On the other side, the receiver was exactly the same, except that at the moment it was empty, of course. They activated the mechanism, and instantly the machine began to work. It first undid the box, little by little, witnesses saying it looked a bit like a 3D printer in reverse. Every single atom in the cardboard box was disengaged, allowing the box to enter the proper liminal state to be carried through the air, across the room, and captured by the receptacle, where it would be rebuilt. The problem was that once the box disappeared, it didn't reappear. Scientists, technicians, engineers reviewed their equations and plans, but found no errors. Both machines were perfect, but no matter what they did, the box wouldn't come back. Nobody knows how long it took from that first test until everything went really wrong. None of those involved in the project said anything, no matter how hard they were pressed. The most they could say was that they had no idea what had happened. At this point, everyone believed them. Nobody had a clue, but at the time, no one did. and they were accused of being the horsemen of the apocalypse. The thing is, a month ago, the cardboard box reappeared. The problem was that it didn't appear on the receiver of the teleporter machine. It didn't even show up in the room they were experimenting with. No, the box appeared in outer space, floating, and it didn't end there. The first one was followed by more and more. The boxes continued to appear throughout space, around the planet, around the moons, even around the sun. The satellites were blocked because the cardboard didn't allow the waves to pass. That's when the internet went down, and everyone really started freaking out. When were they going to upload the videos of what was happening? Where did they go to fight with strangers? Who would they tell their conspiracy theories to? Television was the next thing to fall. Everything was desperate. Everyone was desperate, except for the owners of the newspaper, who were able to put the old printing presses back in operation. The world seemed to go back to the beginning of the 20th century, when only paper newspapers and radios existed. Antique dealers made money, selling old radio sets that had been forgotten for decades. The last image NASA received from the space telescope was so strange and terrifying that no one knew what to say. Not even the news headlines were able to come up with a sensational phrase. The reality was worse than anything they could exaggerate. Space was filled with cardboard boxes. Literally. The image from the satellite had shown NASA that the boxes were not only around the Earth, but also around all the objects in the universe. Planets, stars, even galaxies. It was as if all the empty space in the universe had been replaced with cardboard boxes. All because an experiment had went wrong. In the first week, the sky seemed to be on fire. Looking up, large flares could be seen streaking across the sky, caused by the boxes crashing into Earth's atmosphere and burning up in the process. And since the boxes were everywhere, the whole sky was constantly crossed by flames. Eventually, the flames stopped, and darkness engulfed everything. The boxes had blocked out the sunlight. That's when the temperature started to drop. The snow soon appeared, covering everything. It wasn't long until the entire population had to take refuge, and the temperature just kept dropping. No one knew what the limit would be, just as no one knew whether it would be reversible or how long we would survive. For my part, I didn't have much hope. I was never someone who understood much about science, but I'm sure that if the boxes were still up there, it'll all be over soon. I'm not even sure if all the supplies I have will do any good. The bunker, after all, was built to survive a nuclear disaster, not a permanent winter. The walls are thick and well insulated, but I can already feel the cold coming in. I have a stove, but only one, because I never thought it would be so cold. It was never so cold here where I live, and no one ever told me to worry about that. I should have grabbed another one before I went in, but all I got were blankets. All the ones that were in my house, which weren't many either. I already have one around my body, because I started shivering just now. I'm next to the stove. I'm wearing the thickest jacket I have, but the cold seems to be coming in. It's been almost 3 days since I got into the bunker. The radio is static, and I don't even have the heart to watch movies. I'm afraid I'll freeze while doing it without realizing it. I have a cup of hot coffee in my hand. I left the kitchen on to heat the environment a little more, but I know I'm going to have to turn it off soon because the bunker is hermetic, and although it has an air purification system, I can get poisoned by combustion gases. That's something they always told me when I built it, that I had to be careful with the kitchen. I wonder what will be less painful, death by cold or death by gas poisoning. If the internet still existed, I'd look it up, although I really don't know if I want to know the answer. I get up, dragging the blanket behind me, and finish turning off the stove. It's better to be cautious. I go back to my place by the stove and grab my cup of coffee. It helped warm me up a bit, but not too much because it cooled down pretty quickly. The last sip I take seems to be taken from the fridge. This damn bunker has turned into an ice cream parlor. I bet if I turned off the refrigeration that I have, everything would stay the same. And that makes me wonder, how long will it be until the power goes out? Because I'm sure that the cables coming from the power plant must already be having problems. I know some areas that have been under blackout, Here, luckily, nothing's happened yet. I hope it lasts a long time. I don't want to imagine what it'll be like to be cold and in the dark on top of that. Well, it would be almost like being outside, I guess. Outside with the dark sky, no stars, no sun, without even being able to see the light of the moon. Just cardboard boxes, which are not even visible from here. We only know they're there because of the flares and the photos. Damn teleportation. Nobody needed it. Why did they have to invent it? It's useless. It wouldn't solve anything. Why? I guess it's nobody's fault, really. No one could have imagined that the experiment would go so wrong. After all, in whose head could something like this bring about the end of the world? I wrap myself in another blanket. I don't know if it's really colder or I'm just imagining it. I look at the clock and see that it's already night, but I can't sleep. I don't want to risk falling asleep and never waking up. Damn, it's really cold here, I whisper to myself, to no one in particular, to the universe. Before starting this post, even if it's a story that happened years ago, I just want to make it clear that every name included in this post was changed to make sure to protect the kid's privacy. You see, ever since I met this kid, he's always intrigued me. But no matter how hard I try to ignore the little strange things surrounding him, I can't seem to brush off that awful feeling which shakes my composure. A feeling that creeps on me every time I look at him from afar, from where he can't see me. I was 36, and he was no more than 7. I should be responsible. I was his teacher. Be able to rationalize everything and keep my head cool no matter the circumstances. Yet, it's getting harder and harder to act like nothing is wrong with how his brain is working. I'm not trying to inculpate him. I actually fear what his behavior might do to me in the following years. Hence why I'm writing this. You see, this particular student, whom I'm calling Basile, for clarity's sake, has always acted a bit out of it, as my colleagues and some of my friends put it. He's a kid that's always loved smiling, for no particular reason. He just loves doing it. However, I started to sense that something was wrong with him when he wouldn't stop, even after getting hurt or messing up in class. I can guarantee that Basile might be the clumsiest student I've ever had. What generally unnerves me the most about Basile, however, is his prolonged periods of complete blackout. He has a tendency to completely shut his brain off to the rest of the world and simply watch in silence the emptiness around him, only coming back with a laugh and teary eyes when someone urges him to respond. It's like he lives in his own little world most of the time. Sadly, it's a major deterrent in his social life. Given that he mostly dozes off or shuts his brain down during class, he's a subject of mockery that can resemble bullying a bit too much for my taste. I try my best to mitigate this negative attention he seems to always get, but that doesn't stop him from slowly becoming a pariah during breaks. To be fair, Basile does have something close to a friend. Well, at least he seems to like him, even if that feeling isn't mutual. It's a kid that I'll call Quentin, and what you should remember about him is that he unfortunately got caught in a car crash with his family. All survived with more or less minor injuries, except for Quentin, who lost the usage of his legs. He was inconsolable for weeks, mostly because he couldn't partake in his favorite sport anymore. That's when Basile started to become extremely interested in him, and when I truly started to see just how deep the rabbit hole surrounded this kid goes. Quentin, after finally gathering the courage to go back to school for the first time in months, was immediately jumped by Basile. Obviously, a lot of them were curious or saddened by his state. Basile, however, really was the only one to be excited about it. He didn't seem to have any ill will towards his now disabled comrade, yet the whole class was off-put by his earnest attempts to cheer Quentin up, often resulting in some fighting and crying on Quentin's side. Strangely, His protest never deterred Basile, who simply continued this thing without bearing any hard feelings or getting angry at the other kids. He became way more active, but was still trapped inside his bubble. He could still spend minutes, maybe hours, just staring into space, especially in class. In the end, I think it worked out, though. After days of trying to make Basile stop bothering Quentin, the latter came to me and simply asked to let him be. Even if I don't know why he's changed so much, he's the only one at school that treats me like a person. Doesn't make everything a pity party. He's kinda nice, even if he's weird, so I don't mind his presence. It didn't feel satisfying at all. Didn't feel right at all. Nonetheless, since both parties seemed content with the situation, I couldn't get involved in all of this. At least, I shouldn't have. But Basile's behavior seemed stranger and stranger to me. He was starting to speak of seeing Quentin walking in an empty space. He drew disturbing imagery, sometimes simply coloring the page with one color, before speaking of the many wonders inside the color. I couldn't bear it anymore. I needed to find its root. I wondered many times before going through with this, if I was going insane. Still, my curiosity and my fear won over my rationality, so I asked Basile to stay in class. He didn't seem to really mind or question why I asked him. Thankfully, he actually came instead of forgetting about the appointment, as he tended to do for anything related with administration. However, his clumsiness or lack of attention led to him hitting a wall and getting the door to his face while trying to walk up to my office. I also noted his lack of focus when I tried to reassure him that he didn't look too bad. He seemed entirely comfortable with how he acted these past few weeks. No regret or self-doubt. This led me to audibly sigh. Basile didn't seem to catch my exasperation. His expression remained unwavering. Small smile, empty eyes, and it was as if he was frozen like a statue. Knowing I wouldn't go far by trying to find a roundabout way to get him to explain his change in attitude, I opted for a more straightforward approach. Basile, I need you to be honest with me. What is it, Teach? The sentence actually piquing his curiosity. I spoke again, hoping my tone wouldn't betray any kind of nervousness. What's going on with Quentin? Why did you suddenly feel the need to be nice towards him? His apathy was replaced by something I couldn't read at the time. He looked extremely embarrassed, but also guilty. And still, he let out a laugh. It didn't sound childish despite his age. It sounded desperate. I can make things right, if I can take care of Quentin. He was starting to shake as his voice became weaker and weaker. However, this sudden show of weakness was quickly replaced by a sudden jump onto my desk. Teach, can I ask you a question? I backed off a bit before actually answering. Sure, but stay in your chair, please. He made a small, apologetic sound before resuming his talking. If something disappears, it's -1, right? I had no idea where he was going with this. Yeah? Ignoring my confusion, he continued. But if something is given in return, it's +1, right? I nodded in response. He was beaming with misplaced pride. He probably misunderstood my confusion, or thought getting his teacher confused made him smarter. Well, if -1 meets +1, then they cancel each other out, so nothing has happened in the end. I couldn't bear seeing the conversation get more and more astray, so I asked, Basile, where are you going with this? Then it hit me. Is this about Quentin's lost legs and how you're trying to be an uplifting influence on him? Is that it? I appreciate you trying so hard to brighten his day, but I wasn't sure what to say next, or if him comparing this ordeal to a mathematical operation was a good sign or not. But in the end, I took it as just a little boy being concerned for a classmate's well-being. However, he looked at me strangely. No, the -1 is me. The +1 is Quentin's bad day. I was dead wrong. His cold answer, one that seemed so logical in his mind, frightened me. This was the first time in my career I felt any kind of fear towards one of my pupils. I struggled to get out another word, but I needed to know more. What do you mean by that? He smiled brightly, innocently. Well, I'm a bad kid, so this accident gives me a chance to be better. Flabbergasted, outraged, speechless. These words wouldn't even be enough to describe how I was feeling at that moment. Several thoughts plagued my mind. What kind of 7-year-old thinks and acts this way? How can he say things like that with such a carefree attitude? What about that moment of weakness? Did I imagine it? I tried to pry a bit more, but he wouldn't speak about it. His brain had shut down when I asked about why he thought of himself this way. He left my office without listening to me, that unnerving boy disappearing from my view, although his little cries in the corridor didn't escape my ears. I had the urge to join him in the corridor and comfort him, especially if he actually was putting up a front when talking about his self-esteem issues. Yet I stopped myself. I rationalized that me suddenly showing up wouldn't help him open up to me. But as he left, I heard his footsteps coming to a sudden halt. A weak "Dad" was all I could fully understand before the footsteps came back in my direction. Basil was standing in my doorway, his eyes darker than anything I'd ever seen. He wasn't saying anything, just looking at me at what felt like an eternity. I tried to say something, but the words just died in my throat. He opened his mouth to answer my almost question. If only I could trade your life for his, you invading prick. But it was deep, too deep. His voice couldn't belong to a child. Still, Basil was the only thing in front of me. He had to have said it. I was petrified. He left without saying another word. The suffocating silence of the classroom was all that reminded me of the fact that I was alive. After minutes, maybe hours, I continued my usual routine as if nothing had happened. I locked the classroom, went to my car, and drove myself home as I sat on my rundown sofa. Nothing out of the ordinary. Except I had no recollection of ever doing that. It was as if my mind had been completely shut down. I simply awoke in the middle of the night, briefly wondering how I even got back to my flat before going back to sleep. Well, sleep is a generous word to describe what happened that night. Nightmares kept me company, and I had to call off the next day due to my unbelievable tiredness. Eventually, I calmed down and went back to my job, but I became wary of Basil. I found myself staring at him more and more, hoping to prevent him from catching me by surprise. However, my behavior ended up being a frequent subject of questions and discussions among the students. Not wanting the situation to get out of control, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I needed to stop being worried about one of my students, especially if my behavior could end up damaging said student's reputation. I was a professional. I couldn't let my bias overtake my duties. I was scared. It pains me to admit it now, but I found myself terrified of Basil. Being scared of a grade schooler. How pathetic. That's why it took me a month to properly gather up the courage to ask for a meeting with his family. In the meantime, the rumors had begun to run rampant, and some people tried to bully Basil. I felt ashamed. It was exactly what I had predicted, yet I could not act to defend this child. Luckily, Quentin had stepped in, even amongst his former friends. I wasn't sure if their friendship was healthy, but I was glad he was around, no matter how uncomfortable I got while watching them play. Sometimes, Basil would show Quentin people or events that didn't seem to exist or happen. He could also hurt him by saying that he could see him running freely somewhere, or abruptly stop his movements to cry out at something. As for Quentin, sometimes he would brawl with Basil, or a bully, but most of the time, he would push Basil out of harm's way. It was strange how poor his luck seemed to be. Nonetheless, they were happy like this. I didn't know what to think. Still, I needed to meet his family. So, I stopped finding excuses. That's why 2 weeks later I found myself at the doorstep of a small but seemingly cozy house. I was greeted by a middle-aged lady, looking slightly older than I was. She invited me in, but I found no sign of Basil, only pictures of him with a man I didn't recognize. When I asked her about her son, her face illuminated with motherly joy. "Oh, my little angel isn't here right now. He's currently playing with his new friend." I tried to get her to clarify what she meant. "Are you talking about Quentin?" She clapped her hands together. "Yes, that's his name. He's one of your students, I assume." Poor thing. She didn't add anything else, but she didn't have to. She knew about the accident. That meant I could safely bring out the topic of Basil's behavior more easily. I cleared my throat. "Yeah, Quentin's been the subject of something terrible." She cut me off before I could add anything else. "That's why I'm proud of my baby for deciding to become his friend. I was scared he would end up alone, but to hear that those two are getting along so well, it's truly a miracle." The heavy feeling in my chest came back. No point in beating around the bush. I needed to be more direct. "About that, miss, I think your son's not being a healthy support system for Quentin." Her cheerful behavior slowly faded away, being replaced by something I can only describe as saddened resignation. Her smile was still there, but much thinner, her eyes pleading me to stop talking. A faint, "Oh no," left her lips. I found it strange that his first friend was handicapped because of... I found myself insisting, pushing her to tell me why Basil is the way he is. Tears started to stroll down her face, so I reassured her. "Miss, I want to help both of these kids, but please, be honest with me. What happened to Basil? Why is he the way that he is?" Regardless of her tears, her eyes looked into mine. The sadness and fatalism were mixed together in a stare I would remember my entire life. "Basil heard his father die in a car crash while on the phone with him." Despite sitting in a chair, I felt my entire body grow heavier with each passing second. I couldn't move. Images were flashing inside my head. "Was it... I'm so sorry for your loss," I said to the woman, who was now barely holding her tears. My words were sincere, but they must have sounded so fake to someone who's still in grievance. Still, I continued to talk in hopes that I would learn more and diffuse the situation. "If I'm not being too indiscreet, you already were, you idiot," I told myself. "May I learn more about Basil, how he was prior to this, and how this affected him?" His mother silently nodded, eyes still red, and told me everything. "You see, my son has always been a secluded person with a view of the world that nobody could fully grasp. Among what you would describe, like seeing fictional persons or drawing moves on his own, are things he actually did before. Thankfully, his father did his best to connect with him, and it worked. Basil was always excited to show him his new creation or talk about his latest epiphany, but then the tragedy struck." A hiccup interrupted her tale, so I timidly tried to reassure her. "If it's too hard for you, don't feel obliged to continue." She shook her head. "No, I feel it's good to let everything out. Another oddity surrounding Basil is his poor luck. Whenever he tries to do something, most of the time it backfires. Some of the more superstitious members of the family even ended up thinking he was cursed. That's obviously not the case. It's ridiculous. But only my husband, his father, had the strength to protest, defend him, against them." Hearing this, a question came to me. Is that outlook on his luck one of the reasons he mostly prefers to keep to himself? She offered a weak, "I don't know," as a response before saying, "At least fictional characters can't hurt him." Another pause in the conversation happened, the air gradually becoming tenser and tenser. "He heard everything. When I asked him to phone his father, I never expected..." Her face gradually lost her color. That should have been my cue to stop prodding. But I didn't. I was foolish enough to continue. I've also seen Basil get lost in his mind, even with his new friend. He can cry or laugh about whatever he sees. Is there something other than fictional characters or famous people that he can think about? Has he ever talked to you about it?" Wordlessly, his mother stood up and incited me to follow her up the stairs. A bit of a silent walk later, we arrived in the attic, where a little box stood out. It was well kept compared to the dusty furniture all around it. She opened it and took out a stack of papers. "He never explicitly told me, but I've seen his drawings," she said before handing them over. I felt like I was going to cry myself. Most had little notes in the left corner, explaining when or how he saw these visions. Most were crudely drawn, but strong with emotions. Some had Quentin happily walking. Some had Basil's father cuddling him or coming to school to take him home. But others were red or black, scribbled messes. Me when Dad got hurt. Dad going elsewhere. Quentin leaving. Me when Mom doesn't love me anymore. His imagination was completely corrupted by tragedy. No matter how hard he tried to forget it, his subconscious would catch up. His positive daydreams would turn to nightmares. He blamed himself for everything. I could now understand what he meant, despite how twisted his -1+1 explanation sounded. He was just a kid, trying to fix his mistake after being given another chance. Although with that said, one of his drawings intrigued me more than others. It was a poorly drawn representation of himself, being held by the throat by a black figure. "He haunts me." I presented it to his mother. "Miss, what is that? What are you doing?" It was that voice again, the voice that shouldn't belong to a child. The two of us turned around instinctively to see Basil, knife in hand, an expression of pure rage on his face. His mother tried to calm him down. "Basil, snap out of it." However, instead, his eyes locked onto me, with a look of hatred so intense, he couldn't just describe it with words. He rushed at me and stabbed violently at my knee. The pain was unbelievable. Yells, blood, cries. That's all I saw before I fainted from shock. When I awoke, I was being taken by ambulance. The mother was frantically apologizing to me. I tried to reassure her, but when I saw Basil showing no remorse next to her, I couldn't bring myself to be gentler with her. My fears had come back, and his eyes haunted me to this day. What was he talking about in that drawing? Surely ghosts aren't real. However, what is it that possesses him during these violent outbursts? I think I'll never know for sure. After I recovered from my leg wound, at least as much as I could, the school administration made no concessions. Seeing that I was now forced to have a cane with me for the rest of my life, they promptly excluded Basil from school. Quentin tried to continue going to school, but the bullying and rumors were too tough even for him. He begged to be sent where Basil was. Apparently they reunited in some sort of youth re-education center. I had no idea if I should be opposed to this decision, but it didn't matter. Sadly, that's all there is to it. These conversations and drawings did give me the insight on how Basil saw the world. A lonely place that he might make friendlier, but I couldn't help him. His deep-rooted self-loathing, his general lack of focus, his obsession with Quentin. Speaking of which, neither of them showed up at the class reunion, which happened this year. According to one of their classmates, the soul who actually saw them after they went to rehab, it was better that way. Had Basil crossed a line? Had he rendered Quentin so dependent on him? Just like a lot of things in this post, I don't know. I couldn't even think or say anything when the student told me about it. So, here I am, now 48. 13 years have passed. Multiple children became my pupils, and I didn't encounter another Basil ever again. The doubts are eating me alive as I write this, for failing to offer any kind of solution, for letting this disturbing kid get away. Am I a failure as a teacher? Hi guys. Not sure if this is the right place for it, but I thought that if anyone would be interested in my story, then it'd probably be the people here. So I moved into a new place recently. It's a pretty good spot, nice and quiet, right at the edge of town. The rent's really decent as well, especially for a newly renovated apartment in this area of London. Apparently the building's been around for ages, and the location isn't super ideal for a lot of people, so they had to keep the rent low. No complaints from me, though. I don't have a car, and I can cycle pretty easily to the nearby station. Moving in was straightforward enough, and I'm pretty satisfied with the place so far. Here's where it gets a little weird. Shortly after settling in, I noticed that a patch of loose carpet was right at the threshold between where the bedroom connects to the living room. Now, normally, I would have just called the landlord to fix it, but it didn't seem like a big enough deal at the time. Thought I'd take care of it myself, save some cash in the process, right? Upon looking at the carpet more closely, I found something a bit unusual. There was a little gap where the carpet seemed to sag. When I pulled the carpet back, I found a little patch, no wider than my fist, where it looked like the floorboard had decayed, revealing a subfloor beneath. It was a bit like poking a hole in the top layer of foil on one of those prepackaged meals. A little peephole revealing everything that was beneath. I'm a pretty curious guy by nature, so couldn't help but shine a torch in there and have a quick peek. I wasn't expecting much, but to my surprise, right beneath the hole, there sat an unassuming little object. It was a squarish shape, which barely stood out amongst the dust, dirt, and mold. When I first saw it, I thought it was a tablet, an iPad, or a Kindle or something. With a coat hanger, some mounting tape, and a lot of practice, I eventually managed to fish it out. Out in the light, I could see that it was in fact not an iPad, like I had hoped, but a little hardcover-bound book. Though the exterior was essentially eaten away by black mold, I could still make out a single word impressed upon the faded leather cover. Journal. Inside, the pages were in pretty bad shape. The first half of the journal was irretrievable, mold-stained and practically crumbling to the touch, and I could barely leaf through them without causing irreversible damage. The back half wasn't much better, with a good portion of it torn out or, strangely enough, burned. In addition, a lot of the writing itself was illegible, either crossed out, faded, or too frantically scrawled to be comprehensible. Around the margins and in the spaces between the words, I could make out strange sketches, shapes of figures that are hard to describe. I'll see if I can upload some photos later. The contents are unusual, if not disturbing. It's a little disparate because of how much of the text is unreadable, but I've transcribed the parts I could make out and ordered them chronologically here. Let me know what you guys think. Journal entry. Monday, April 4th, 1953. Recently I've been feeling unwell. Upon returning from my latest trip to the east, I found that my whole body aches, and I'm constantly stricken by bouts of weakness and fatigue. I cannot stand for long, as the world spins when I'm upright. Most concerning, I seem to be experiencing hallucinations, strange visual distortions, which addle both my mind and my depth perception. Stranger still, I no longer dream. Doctors have attributed it to an exotic ailment, exposure to miasmas or viral disease, an insect bite maybe. The source varies with each practitioner I meet. I don't know when this started. I don't recall the reason that I went to Asia in the first place. Friday, April 29th, 1953. Symptoms have descended upon me quickly, like a fog. In addition, my recollection has become hazy as well. I'm unable to recall what it feels like to be without malaise. I have no recollection of my travels now. If it were not in this journal, I would not know that I had traveled at all. The doctors attribute this state of being to a range of ailments. It differs with every visit. Bilious fever, illness in the ears or eyes or brain, even hormonal imbalances because my state of paranoia and neurosis. Yet, the tests have been fruitless. Physically, my body is not inconsistent with the body of a perfectly healthy human being. At this point, I care not about the cause. The symptoms are all I experience, and the brief respite from these afflictions is my only desire. Wednesday, June 15th, 1953. As my condition worsens, more unique symptoms have come to the surface. In the past, I have written in my journal to distract myself from the turbulent environment around me. But now, when I must put pen to paper, I've been unable to conjure neither the words nor the images necessary to describe my past experiences. I can only focus on my present state of the world which appears before my sensations in the here and now. In the future, I might look back on these entries and recall this affliction which had ailed me for so long. But I'm doubtful. Thoughts of the future are becoming hazy also. Sunday, June 19th, 1953. These visions, they have only grown in vividness and intensity. No longer are they simply the distortions in shapes and colors in the ordinary objects. Now, entirely new objects have emerged. Like balloon animals being inflated, thin figures billow outward, creating uneven, grotesque forms. Almost always they're bulbous, organic things, bulging and pulsating before my eyes. July 2nd, 1953. Day uncertain. As I grow more accustomed to these visions, their features become more distinguished. What once was just vague, opaque blobs have now become strangely defined substances, or perhaps even organisms of a sort. Perhaps even flora. Although they vary greatly in shape, color, and size, it is clear that there exists a certain resemblance between some more than others. It's possible they even belong to specific and distinct genre. But enough of this. To categorize hallucinations like they were undiscovered zoological species is an act that even my addled brain can recognize as insanity. July 1953. They've begun moving now. Soundlessly they creep across my sightline, some locomoting like caterpillars, while others slink on wireframe feet. These feet-thin feelers, reminiscent of an ant's antenna, poke and probe the ground ahead, as if searching for stable ground. Dozens of these feelers extend from below their bodies, globular, ovid masses, which appear as smooth as they are pliant. Others sit upon stem, like detached eyes floating in place. On more than one occasion, I've seen small ones collide, merge, and become one entity. Some of the larger ones, in fact, appear as a collection of small globules, orbs upon its body so numerous that it simulates fur. I can only wonder if they're a singular organism or simply a congregation of them moving as one. In these pages, I see that I have once referred to them as flora. I now see that that was an error. Yet neither are they fauna. They're a sort of combination, not quite animal, not quite plant. July 1953. They're everywhere. I've seen them creep across my page. I've seen them loom outside my window. They're not visions. I've reached out and touched them. The one I felt was chewing gum colored. It was warm and fleshy to the touch. 1953. Perhaps they've always been there. Silent, numerous, invisible to the human eye. Perhaps my affliction is not an illness, but insight. I've gained access to a world truer than my own, but this is no blessing. To watch and feel these things creep over my body, pulse on my bed, cast their shadows over my building, it is something no man should see. Date uncertain. I awoke with one of them in my mouth. It crawled out so easily, as mundane as a laborer leaving their family home for work. It left a slick and pungent trail behind. It tasted like gasoline. How long had it resided within me? How many of these creatures had I unknowingly ingested in my lifetime? My throat burns as I retch. Amongst the remains of my last meal, things shift and slither. I don't know how much more of this I can take. Date uncertain. To my family, if I had one, Please burn this diary if you were ever to find it. I would do it myself, but I fear to exit my drawing room. In fact, I'm no longer able to stand at all. Fixed to my writing chair, I can only sprawl upon the page, gazing out of my window to watch the world become unrecognizable before my eyes. I see them. Even when I close my eyes, I see them. They live beneath my eyelids, beneath my skin. I fear that they see me. My name is Sidney White. I'm writing this because my therapist thinks it'll help. I'm honestly willing to try anything to get a little peace of mind at this point. For my background, this incident began in April of my junior year of high school when I was 16. I'm about average height with blue eyes and long brown hair. My mom and I live alone in an old 19th century Victorian-style house that's been passed down in our family for generations. Someday I'm set to inherit the house, though I'm not sure I really want it anymore. The house is complete with 3 stories, a basement, and a sizable front and back porch. There's a chest-high iron fence surrounding the property. My room's on the 2nd floor. It has a white marble balcony with 2 elegant glass doors leading onto it. Ever since I was little, I'd always adored the house. The ancient black and white photographs of my ancestors, outdated furniture, the relics gathered by family members throughout the years, all instilled in me a longing sense of nostalgia. As a child, I would often just sit in the living room for hours, daydreaming of what it would have been like to live here decades ago, or even centuries before. I would let my imagination run wild with fantasies from times long ago, until eventually Mom would drag me from my stupor and urge me to play with the other kids in the area. This was my only qualm with the house. Due to its old and slightly dilapidated state, I found it very difficult to keep friends. The other kids constantly whispered amongst themselves, and rumors that the house was haunted spread like wildfire on a dry summer day. The creaking of the floorboards and the whistling of the AC unit through the empty corridors were sounds that I'd almost grown accustomed to after residing there my entire life. To the other kids, though, this was hard proof that there were ghosts roaming the halls, waiting to claim their next victim. The same routine would play out time and time again, every time I brought a new friend over. After a little coaxing, they'd come inside, stay for a couple of minutes, then make up some half-hearted excuse to hightail it back home. My humble abode repelled more children than Monster House. Due to this, I didn't have many friends growing up, and the trend continued well into my high school years. So you can imagine my excitement when Alex from my 3rd period English class announced that he was throwing a party while his parents were out of town, and that the whole class was invited. I was ecstatic. I'd never even hung out with the boys, let alone gone to a party. The days leading up to the event were filled with anxious anticipation. I was obsessing over the thought that I might meet a cute boy and have my first taste of alcohol, all in one glorious night. Then the date finally arrived, and I was a bundle of nerves. I'd spent hours curling my hair and perfecting my makeup, convinced that at some point my knight in shining armor would glide in and sweep me off my feet. I had made arrangements to ride to the party with Stephanie, a somewhat nerdy girl who didn't have many friends of her own. I knew she only offered to take me so she wouldn't have to show up to the party by herself, but I didn't mind. Honestly, I didn't want to arrive alone either. After what felt like hours, Stephanie's blue Honda Civic inched up my driveway. I sauntered towards the vehicle, radiating confidence. "Have fun, Sidney," Mom yelled after me, as her gaze followed me down the drive from the spot in the doorway. "And try not to drink too much," she mused with a wink. A smile had spread across her face that I couldn't help but chuckle at. I always thought my mom was gorgeous, a trait that was, unfortunately, not passed down to me. I was reminded of that fact all too often, as it was a popular topic amongst school bullies. "It's not that kind of party, Mom," I lied as I rolled my eyes dramatically. "Whatever you say," she shrugged, flashing a toothy grin. Mom's long blonde hair fluttered in the breeze as she waved goodbye. Her deep green eyes shimmered with pride, hoping in vain that I'd form some semblance of a friendship. The party was a major letdown. I won't bore you with too many details, but only about 10 people actually showed up, including us. I didn't realize how gross beer would taste, but I somehow managed to choke down a couple of Budweisers. After being hit on by nearly every guy at the party, I begged Stephanie to take me home. She was having more fun than I was, but after some persisting, she begrudgingly caved. The ride back to my house was marred by a tense, uncomfortable silence. As Stephanie hurriedly peeled away, I stumbled up the driveway and fished into my pocket for my house key. I'd gotten a little more tipsy than I realized, and my already lackluster cognitive skills eluded me. I eventually located the key, though. I jabbed at the keyhole, and after a couple of sloppy attempts, the door clicked open. I crept up the stairs as silently as I could in my inebriated state, putting forth my best effort not to wake up my mother. Once I made it up the stairs, I ran through my nightly bedtime routine and retreated to my room. I popped into bed and tried to drift off to sleep, the immense disappointment of the night still fresh in my mind. After a few minutes of restlessly tossing and turning, I picked up on a noise at my balcony door. I perceived that the sound was like a faint tapping on the glass. Tap, tap, tap. I drowsingly glanced over at my alarm clock. Midnight. I ignored it and rolled onto my side, facing the wall. Probably just a tree branch. But then, the tapping escalated to 3 knocks in rapid succession. Tap, tap, tap. I shot up in bed as a pang of fear coursed through me. I whipped my head to the balcony, fully expecting to lock eyes with some horrid creature. And nothing. It must have been the alcohol messing with my head. A little shaken up, I laid back and somehow fell into a fitful slumber. The following morning, I woke up to the tantalizing aroma of bacon and eggs wafting upstairs from the kitchen. I stumbled out of bed and groggily traced the scent downstairs, where Mom was cooking breakfast. "Good morning, sleepyhead," she giggled. "Morning," I croaked, trying and failing to rub the sleep out of my eyes. "Did you have fun last night?" Mom asked, as she placed a mouth-watering concoction of eggs, bacon, and toast before me. "Yeah, I guess," I wearily replied, shoveling food into my mouth. I wasn't feeling great from the night before, and the hot meal was just what the doctor ordered. "Meet any cute guys?" Mom prodded, a smile plastering itself across her face. "Oh yeah, some real cute Leonardo DiCaprios," I sarcastically remarked, mouth nearly overflowing with eggs. "By the way, you didn't hear any knocking from any of the windows last night, did you?" I inquired nonchalantly. "No. When did you hear that?" she asked quizzically, concern washing over her countenance. Never mind. It was probably just a tree branch," I blundered between chews, attempting to ease Mom's tension. "Okay, just please let me know if you hear it again," she requested sternly, seeming relieved by my statement. The remainder of the day was mostly uneventful. After breakfast, I wasted the day watching Netflix. I finished off my evening by knocking out some homework. It was Saturday, but getting my work out of the way early provided me a sense of productivity. After putting my books away and brushing my teeth, I hopped into bed. I'm usually off in dreamland no later than 10:30, and that night was no different. I laid back and shut my eyes, but I was having an uncharacteristically tough time falling asleep. I was overthinking, stressing myself out over the upcoming chemistry exam, something I felt wildly unprepared for. I had just started to nod off when I heard it. The same rhythmic tapping on my balcony door. Tap, tap, tap. I lazily turned to the clock. Midnight. Before I could divert my attention to the noise, it started again, but this time it was much louder. Tap, tap, tap. Again, I bolted upright and fixed my gaze on the balcony. My heart pounded against my rib cage, and I thought it would leap through my chest at any given moment. I could have sworn for a split second that I glimpsed a shadow ducking out of view. I don't have to tell you, I was more than a little creeped out at this point. I shined my flashlight at the door and discovered an absence of creepy shadow people. I laid back down and breathed deeply in an attempt to regulate my racing heart. I again wrote it off as a tree branch or my mind playing tricks on me, and eventually I managed to doze off. The tapping continued every night going forward. Right at midnight, I'd be ripped from my peaceful slumber to a commotion at the balcony that wouldn't cease until I'd inevitably turn to face it, and every time, there was nothing there. After a couple of weeks, it was beginning to take a toll on me. I was sleep deprived. My grades began to slip. People started to notice. Concerned teachers pulled me aside and asked if everything was okay at home. Classmates were telling me I looked like a ghost. Mom repeatedly questioned me on it, but I just told her that I was stressed about the exams. I desperately needed to put a stop to this incessant tapping. One night, I'd had enough. As usual, at midnight, I was yanked from my peaceful sleep. I had made up my mind. This time, I was going to ignore it. It started off light. Tap, tap, tap. Then it grew louder and increased in frequency. Tap, tap, tap. I was determined not to look. I kept my eyes firmly shut, even when the slapping turned into a pounding. Boom, boom, boom. I was beginning to worry that whatever or whoever it was would crack the glass. Irritated, I relented, and my eyes wandered to the double doors. What I saw chilled me to my very core. There was a man standing on the balcony. Dirty, tattered clothing hung off his emaciated frame like rags. He was deathly thin, reminiscent of a skeleton, with his skin stretched tightly over bones. Stringy, greasy black hair fell past his shoulders. The wide smile that blossomed across his face revealed black gums and yellow, rotting teeth. His manic expression never faltered, but worst of all were his eyes. Those black, pinpoint pupils connected to mine, and I could sense something beneath them, even through the glass. Hunger, a deep animalistic drive that I can only describe as predatory. Then he spoke. "Oh, Sydney, I can see you," he sang in a sickly sweet tone. "Please let me in. I just want to play," he called, giddy with excitement. My heart dropped into my stomach. Something sinister lurked just beyond the surface of those words. He licked his lips, his disgusting gray tongue worming its way around the rim of his mouth. I tried to avert my gaze, but I was rooted in fear. Sweat pooled on my brow, and my hands shook uncontrollably. My breathing became rapid and shallow. A million thoughts raced through my brain in unison. Who was this man? How did he get onto my second-floor balcony? How the hell did he know my name? I was broken from my trance by the forceful hammering against the door. The man's smile was gone, having developed into an expression of pure hatred. "Let me in, you bitch! Let me in! Let me in!" With each repetition, his fist smashed against the glass, rattling the door in its frame. Then, out of nowhere, he paused, eyes eagerly lighting up as his twisted smile returned, stretching so far that I thought the corners of his mouth might tear. "It's okay, Sydney. You won't let me in? Then I'll do it myself, 'cause I found where you hid the key." He could barely contain his elation as he produced an ancient rusted key from an indistinguishable pocket in his ragged clothes. My head spun and my vision blurred. This couldn't be happening. He slipped the key into the door and unlocked it with a nauseating click. At last, my body regained mobility, and I went into full panic mode. I leapt out of bed and bolted down the hall to my mom's room. The man's deranged cackling reverberated off the walls behind me. His thunderous footsteps were closing the distance. I burst through the door and slammed it shut, waking my mother in the process. "Sid, it's the middle of the night. What's going on?" she groaned lazily. I locked the door and sputtered a nearly incoherent string of words. "Mom, man, inside, police!" I choked out before I broke down, tears streaming down my face. The hallway had gone eerily silent as I sobbed hysterically. Mom stared at me for a second, bewildered, but she did call the cops. They took a statement from me and combed through the house. Of course, by then the man was long gone, and there wasn't much they could do. The balcony doors were even shut and locked when they arrived, so there was no evidence that the man had been on the property at all. They urged us not to hesitate to call back if he returned. and reassured us that they'd send a cruiser down our street intermittently for the next few nights. I slept in Mom's room for a week after that. I questioned her about the hidden spare key, but she swore up and down that there were only 2 house keys. We installed cameras and a home security system, but even then I couldn't bring myself to sleep in that room again. I moved all my things down the hall into an unoccupied room, away from the balcony. Suddenly, every resonance terrified me. Noises that I had previously attributed to the age of the house didn't sound like the normal creaks and whistles anymore. I started going to therapy. After a few weeks, the therapists, my classmates, even my mom, had begun to convince me that I had imagined the whole ordeal. I almost believed them. Almost. My therapist told me that I would never be able to fully heal until I stepped out onto that balcony. So about a month after the incident, I finally built up enough courage to walk out there. I rested my hands on the smooth white marble and peered out over the neighborhood. Spring was among us, and the flowers were in full bloom. I soaked it all in as the wind blew my hair and the dragonflies zipped past my face. I watched a robin feeding its babies in the tall oak tree in our front yard. Bushy-tailed squirrels bounced along, searching for acorns. It was picturesque. I felt completely at peace, standing there just observing nature. All the stress I'd built up from that night was immediately washed away. Until I glanced down, because as I lifted my hands off the stone railing, a strand of long silver hair clung to my fingers. I want to feel something again. The trees are bare. I watch them from the windows. Their limbs dance in the wind. Limbs too thin, like the arms of dying men, like the elbows of the sick. Too many limbs dancing their sickly dance, painting me with their moving patterns. I've become a canvas, it seems. I cough into my arm. It's that time of the year again. Nearly winter, and many of us are coughing. An elderly couple walks by the window, hand in hand, and for a moment they're on my chest, because the sun is low. Their shadows bleed onto me, and for a moment they're walking hand in hand across the street as well as on my chest. It was just a moment, though, before their journey made them leap off my shoulder and onto the wall. The man lets go of her hand and coughs into his fist. Out of sight now, but very much in my mind. I envied the couple. I want to be in love. I want to know that feeling again. Any feeling. Oh, but I do know one feeling. It's the only feeling I can recall for certain, 'cause it's the last feeling I ever felt. It lives in my head like a memory, and when I want it, I can conjure it up from deep below the surface, like a demon from hell, or the spirit of a dead and buried horse, something wild and fierce to ride, a surfer on a rogue wave. Sometimes I do just that, just to feel one thing, anything. Fear. Suffocating fear. Abject fear. Fear, fear, fear. I look for it now and bring it to the surface. I dig it up. My heart matches the speed of its gallop. I stagger and stumble and fall backwards to the floor as I hug my knees and shake. I make a sound, an unconscious sound, a trembling monotone note, the hum of the damned. I'm transported back through time, and suddenly I'm on the dirt road in nowhere North America. My ride is now a cloud of dust on the horizon. Goodbye, joy. Goodbye, other life. Goodbye to so many things, all of them existing in that cloud of dust like an unreachable galaxy. It's dusk, the sun just a red streak below a purple sky. Ahead of me is a house, a quiet, comfy home. The lights are on and cast a tungsten orange glow. Beside the house, there's an axe lodged deep into a stump beside a woodpile. It's my parents' house, and I know it well. I've contributed to that woodpile. I bet that the bottom of the stack could have been my work. The crickets own the night. They play the same song on their endless arena tour. It's a fan favorite. I'll admit that growing up in this bucolic countryside had its luxuries. Clean air, the smell of earth, the lilting hills, the surrounding vibrance and vitality of every living thing. The very ground was rich and fertile, and inside our house, each window was really a painting, and the paintings moved when I moved. The people were kind and neighborly. It was quiet and peaceful and perfect, but something lived with us there. Something cruel and malevolent lurked in the shadow of each peaceful night. Something as rotten and damp as the wood at the bottom of the wood stack invading our comfy home. I knew it because I had seen it around, watching us, waiting for an opportunity to pounce. I heard it in the silence of the laundry room as I walked by towards the warm, welcoming light of the kitchen. I saw it contort on the walls, black and gangly, too many limbs, thin and sickly, but smiling. It was a disease, and its smell was noxious. I left home early, 16 years old. My parents may not mind living in a haunted house, but I couldn't stomach it. It plagued my mind with troubled thoughts, and I knew that pretty soon I'd do something bad, something terrible. I needed to escape. My thumb took me all the way from nowhere North America to everywhere Earth. I was a ramblin' man, a hobo king, a rebel and a bum. I got into drugs, fights, bad situations, good situations, all kinds of shit. My life was saturated and beautiful. I was a walking outlaw. I've heard songs about me. I left that peaceful, comfy home and never looked back. I chose to live rough, down in the weeds. I got a phone call one day. I'm not sure how they got my number, but my father called me up. I hadn't spoken to my parents in years. I thought about them nearly every day, but I was on the run. My dreams sometimes took me back, and in my dreams, I had premonitions. A cloud of blackbirds covering the sky above my parents' house. A lonely sky of nowhere North America. And on the roof and the eaves and the gutters, they sat and cawed and watched me approach with their terrible ink-splotched eyes. My father's voice was on the phone then, and I was telling Janet to shush, but she was naked and tugging on my sleeve. I told her to hush, but she wouldn't, so I put a finger in my ear and listened to my dad. He sounded sick. He was sick. He begged me to come home, a mixture of feelings, a tie-dyed blend of emotions. I had to go. I owed them that much, didn't I? So I went, all the way from everywhere Earth, back to nowhere North America. It took weeks, and a hand job or two to get there, but I finally made it. I had arrived. I thanked the driver, Tommy was his name, and tapped the hood of his car. He drove off, and I'm here again. Tommy was a dust cloud on the horizon, the sky a deep purple above a streak of red, and there were lights on in the house. But I had lied. There was no axe lodged deep in the stump by the woodpile. That was a wishful thought. Goodbye, axe. Goodbye, woodpile. I walked up the steps, feeling a little uneasy. There were no omens here, no dark birds on the roof. This was not a reoccurrence of my dream, but still, there was something foul in the air. A smell like dead, rotten wood, damp and infested with mites. My father was dying, brain cancer, a baseball-sized tumor, he'd said. One would think you'd be able to see it, pulsating through the skull. I'd spoken with my mother since his summoning call, and she had said that it affected his behavior. It put pressure on the part of his mind where feelings reside. He'd cry for no reason at all. He'd laugh like a child as he swatted at flies. His sickness pressed the keys. He was a carousel of painted horses. The horses went by these names: anger, suffering, pleasure, malcontent, melancholy, indignation, repulsion, curiosity, shame, and fear. What I would do to ride those horses now, but only one was available to me. Before knocking, I glanced to the side, towards the lawn and the woodpile and the lone stump. It wasn't fair for them to bring me back here. It wasn't fair that my father was dying. It wasn't fair that I'd have to expose myself to the contortionist that lived in our house, a disease that dampened all my moods but one, a poltergeist with incredible powers, the power to fill my head with troubled thoughts. I thought of Janet and felt nothing, because I was only a guest in this memory. In the moment, though, in the actual moment that I thought of her, I felt a pang of longing, and for a moment, felt like my heart was attached to a grappling hook, and I reeled on my heels as I tried to step forward, towards the house in its orange glow. I was instead pulled 10 steps backwards, towards the dust on the horizon, away from the empty stump, towards her and our love ballad. I jumped off the horse. I unhinged my knees and let the note drop. I sat on the floor in a shaft of light. The wall behind me was a canvas, and in it my father danced. His frail, sickly limbs waved back and forth. His knobby elbows bent and twisted. In his bony hands he held an axe. It came up and down. Rain like blood began to tap on my windows, and it painted the scene with gore. I wished I could feel something. There's something here that suppresses it all, though. The blunt end of an axe, or a cruel entity in the dark corners of the house. Something powerful, with the ability to cover me up with a smile. Something with the ability to put me in a box and leave me there to scream and suffocate. There's a scar above my right eye. It's where my fear resides. My painted horse. It beckons me, and I climb aboard. It brays, wild and fierce, and I ride that rogue wave with my arms around its neck. I hug my knees and begin to hum. I tremble. The crickets hear an almighty orchestra. I climb the steps and stand on the rickety porch. It needs a new paint job. Maybe red. Or purple. Like the sky. I knock on the door back home, the door to coziness and comfort. But also, not just that. Something evil lives here, too. I wait. Goodbye, laughter. Goodbye, sweet bliss. Goodbye, Mom. Goodbye, Dad. No one answers. I let myself in. It's not uncommon in the country to leave the doors unlocked, so this doesn't evoke any immediate concern. But I know better, because I'm only visiting. I've been here before, and I know better. My grip tightens around the neck of the beast I ride, my sweaty hands clutching madly at its silky hair, my face buried in a black mane. I let myself in. I can never get out. It's a box in which I suffocate. The wall is a canvas of abstract art. It's smeared red and purple in complex patterns. The paint's still wet. The floor is where you dip your brush, a spreading puddle. My father greets me with a half smile. One side of his face remains in a palsy frown, but the other side of his face was alive and exuberant, exalted even. He must have been very happy to see me, because he practically erupted with lunatic joy, and he danced up and down and did a little spin. And behind his shoulder, something pitch black, black as the eyes of the birds in my dreams, watches us and smiles at me with black teeth. It lifted a thin black hand and a nice to meet you wave. Goodbye, love. Goodbye, trust. My father's arms were thin as my thumb. They were long and skeletal, weak, his legs unstable stilts. shaking under his weight. He held his arms up above his head, and in his hands was an axe. My mother lay at his feet, an open sack of spilled tomatoes, her eyes like empty pits, dead and glaring, admiring the art on the wall. Goodbye, Faith. Goodbye, sweet lullaby. I turned around and stared out at the world through the still open door. A dirt road in the bucolic countryside. A purple sky above nowhere North America. Home, no more. The crickets hit a crescendo, and it was all I could hear. And then I turned back to the horror that I faced, and my father was right before me, exalted, insane, a man possessed. His feeble arms had wondrous strength, for he brought the axe down hard, blunt end first, and it got me right above the eye. Goodbye, feelings. I did not fall unconscious. My vision blurred, and my right eye watched my father dance through a red veil. The artist came in for another stroke, but I knocked him aside. I wanted to scream because the ride was out of control, the carousel spinning too fast. The family I left, the family I always knew was there if I needed them, the family I would have returned to eventually, and the puppeteer in the shadow of the laundry room, standing there, smiling at me. I turned back to my father, who was still within the grips of his frenzy. He wasn't really my father now. He was a skeleton from a zombie flick, and he had strings coming out of his back, strings that led to the laundry room, much like the tether around my heart that led back to Janet. My father was at its mercy, and it did with him as it would. His arms danced above his head, his legs shook at the knees above the shins. I swallowed dry fear. It tasted like venom, and I calmly plucked the axe from his broken-looking fingers. He was agitated and scratched at me. He called me a whore. My father called me a whore. I walked through the front door and gently closed it behind me. My father did not follow. I descended the steps that once led to my childhood home, and in the purple night I swung that bloody axe into the stump where it belonged. I sat down in the grass, a front row ticket to the cricket show, and hugged my knees and joined their song. The song was called Hum of the Damned, and it was a hit. I got off the horse then, the ride finally over. I don't know why I put myself through that sometimes, but I can't go too long in this apathy. Even fear is better than nothing at all. I left my room and the two-way window. Two-way because it was itself just a painting. And when I moved, the painting moved with me. But also, when the sun was angled correctly, the objects in the painting cast themselves through, onto the chests of the viewers and the bare wall beyond. But the sun was low now, a red streak on the horizon. I worked my way slowly, each creaking step. I did not want to wake my new roommate. He nested silently in the laundry room. Carefully, on tiptoes, I stepped to the door and gently pried it open. I was hit by the nippy breeze of November, a sobering cool that drank the sweat from my brow. My fear now a distant memory, I stood on the rickety porch and stared out at the purple sky in which rain somehow fell from a single black cloud above the house. Over on the lawn there was a stump, and protruding from it like an oblong tumor was the hilt of an axe. They meant nothing to me. I'd said my farewells. The crickets sang their song, and I was unmoved. I thought of Janet, and felt nothing at all. I could leave. I knew that. I could walk down the steps and wander forever down the roads to that unreachable galaxy, to mingle as one with all the dust out there on the horizon. I could. But I had strings coming out of my back, and when my master awoke, he would make me dance. I sighed out of habit, because I really didn't feel like anything that should have resulted in a sigh, and went back inside. I tiptoed up the creaky steps and coughed into my arm. I heard something shuffle in the dark of the hallway. I didn't care. I went to my room and shut the door. The sun's down. My wall is bare. I'm bare. Maybe tomorrow there will be more trees, like limbs dancing on the wall, or couples coughing. Maybe tomorrow I'll envy the dog who sticks his curious muzzle in the rat-infested drain pipe. Maybe tomorrow I'll go for another ride. But for now, I think I'll sleep. And in my dreams, I'll ride that carousel. I'll take a ride on each horse. Oh, how sweet it will be, my dreams, to feel something, anything, besides that dry venom, besides the taste of that black mane, besides the swell of that rogue wave. How sweet it will be to sit on that cloud of dark birds and call it home. I was around 8 years old when I realized, as did my family, that I had a unique memory. Photographic, they called it. It's really nothing like a photograph, though. I always assumed everyone could recall their first day of preschool, the names of the kids they met only once at the arcade. But at 11 years old, my sister Cammie was chosen for a game show on the radio. Without hesitation, she chose me as a roommate to bring with. She could have chosen either of our parents, even our older brother Charlie, who was in college. She could have picked one of her friends, 8th graders like her, but she chose me. I remember sitting around the kitchen table, eating dinner, the pitch-black Midwestern winter night just outside the giant kitchen window behind my dad. He and my mom were totally supportive of the idea. He had offered even to drive us to the radio station. "I would have chosen you too, Bobby," my mom said, laughing. "You remember every weird fact ever." And it was true. I could close my eyes and see every house my parents had ever brought us to. I could draw the floor plan of them if I wanted to. My siblings would ask me to retell stories or movie plots on long car rides. But it wasn't until the radio show, and my sister choosing me as her person, that I knew I had something special. I can still remember going to bed that night after dinner, feeling excited. I finally fell asleep, pressed up against the wall that divided me from my sister's room, her voice through the vents above my bed, saying good night like she did every night. The smell of dust on the furnace, the sound of old creaking boards directly above me in the attic. It was the last night I was happy to have my amazing memory. To this day, I wish I could forget what happened next. I wish I could tell you we won the game show. I wish I could tell you with incredible detail what it was like at the studio. Maybe then, when I closed my eyes, that's what I would see. Not the black, whipping night blurring past me as I ran. I would feel the rush of anticipation and my sister's hand squeezing mine, instead of cold, wet gravel scraping my cheeks and palms when I tried to crawl away on 2 sprained ankles. I would hear the producers cue the canned audience laughter, not the frantic, desperate flapping of leather wings as they neared. Maybe I would have won a t-shirt that still sits in my dresser. Maybe my sister would have won the $1,000 prize. Maybe I would sleep with my door unlocked. I'll never know. What I do know, without a shadow of a doubt, is that I would not have survived any of this if my family hadn't believed me. To this day, it's the thing I am most grateful for in the entire world. It was the day after dinner, on Tuesday, February 17th. School had been agonizingly slow, as I knew it would be all week waiting for Friday. It was all we could talk about on the way home. For years, I'd waited for school with Yuki and my best friend Dominic, who lived on the street perpendicular to mine. The creek crossed under Sistrine Drive and wound its way along Dominic's backyard. There are hundreds of childhood memories in my head, of he and I and our siblings jumping over the creek, building bridges from his yard over the creek to the field behind the rec center. sliding on the ice in the winter, or half-assed fishing and turtle catching in the summer. I always envied my friends who could walk right from their backyard and into the little winding creek. It was cold, but it hadn't snowed in a few weeks. There were still some small patches of ice on the sidewalk, but most of it had melted, along with the slurry gray mounds of stale snow along the curbs and in small scattered patches on the grass. There was massive construction happening on the other side of the creek. They were building a stupid business center on the field we used to play kickball in, the crane visible between two houses behind us. Snow was due that weekend, and everything would be coated and beautiful again. The downside of a blanket of snow was the eerie quiet it caused, and how hard it was to sleep at night when the moonlight and the snow were so bright, even with your closed eyes. It was nearly 6 p.m., and the mid-February sky was already darkening. We had stopped under the flickering gold streetlight at the corner of Citrine and Amethyst, the street that I lived on. I remember huddling close in a group, talking. I remember the wind picking up and the edge of the sky glowing purple behind the house along Citrine. This was when my oldest brother, on break for one more week, drove up to the corner in Mom's old sedan. "Hey, Bobby," he called, giving my friends a little wave that they all returned. He was returning some jeans to the mall and wanted me to come with him. It was rare that Charlie asked me to do anything. I think about that a lot. Had he paid more attention to me before that night, would I have gotten in the car? Would things have been different? I think about all the choices I made that led to that happening, but none as much as the decision to get in the car with my older brother instead of walking home that evening. Maybe I wouldn't sleep in my closet. Maybe I'd have a family of my own. I'll never know. Then again, maybe I would have never seen Charlie again. If you asked, I could tell you every moment on that trip to the mall. The conversation we had, mainly Charlie asking if things fit him or were flattering. Charlie had come out to our parents a few months ago. They were not surprised or fazed. He had told me that night that he had gone to the bar and felt underdressed, and now he felt pressured to be fashionable. The last thing Charlie said to me before we got in the damn car was, "It's funny, even if you're different, there's still pressure to be the same." At 8:53 p.m. on Tuesday, February 17th, 1998, Charlie and I were on the front seat of our mother's 1995 maroon Lamino. We were at the final stop sign on the ride home, and it was 38 degrees outside. Pearl Jam's 10 was in the CD player, and we were at the corner of Pondside and Citrine, about to turn left into our neighborhood, and to home, to be with our family. Our mother had lasagna waiting for us. We were third in line at the three-way stop sign. On Charlie's side of the street was Yuki's house, with pretty lanterns lining the paved path to the courtyard of their U-shaped ranch home. On my side, past my window, was the pond. The path that led around the pond and up the hill was bright at the edge from the streetlights, but quickly faded to black, with only the occasional twinkle of a back porch light in the distance. The remains of the moon tower, built in the 70s, were barely discernible against the sky, only via the absence of stars and the shape of the structures that was only recognizable to those of us who grew up there. It was a scene that had made me feel small and afraid countless times. The cold radiating from the windows made me feel even more anxious, though now I realized that it was the adrenaline, an ancient alarm system going off in my bloodstream, survival mode manifesting in goosebumps, and what I mistook for heebie-jeebies. The black of the moon tower against the blue-black of the sky shifted as my eyes started to adjust. I had thought about a sleepover game Dominic and I had played when we were in 3rd grade, staring at each other's faces in the dark until they morphed and changed and threw us into giggle fits. It wasn't until the bottom left star above the hill disappeared that I realized it wasn't my eyes playing tricks on me. It wasn't until the pitch grew larger that I opened my mouth to say something. Charlie was deep in the chorus of Even Flow and never heard it coming. It was a low whistle, like an old man out for a walk. 2 notes, One high, one low. It repeated again, louder, and I'd turned to tell Charlie when I saw the red light of the brake lights on the car in front of us fade from his face, and he finally saw what was coming. Only, it hadn't come from the pitch black over the pond. It came from the other side, slamming into the driver's side of the car in front of us. It shattered the glass into a hailstorm, crashing onto our windshield. The impact was so intense that both left wheels had lifted off the ground. Charlie initially cursed loudly and went to open the door to help. I'd screamed at him not to, but I barely got a word out before a penetrating silent vacuum filled the air around me, sucking the air out of my lungs. Seconds later, my windows were shattered over me, glass sticking in my cheeks and the wind whipping the blood across my face and into my mouth as I screamed. I knew before I opened my eyes that it wasn't just an accident, that there was no car or bike or even human assailant. I knew before I pried my eyes open that everything I had feared as a child, that all the myths and legends and ghost stories, were real. I knew it wasn't a bat or a bird. I knew as I felt frantic claws at the nylon remains of my seatbelt that it was a monster. Not a cute storybook monster, but an ancient, angry, bitter creature. One that had been there long before I had, or the town had, or even people had. The last thing I saw before I felt the hook sink into my shoulder and I was lifted into the black swirling cold was Charlie, slumped over the steering column, Eddie Vinder's voice still calling out to me until I couldn't hear him anymore. Not for 1 second did I think it was a dream. The cold made sure of that. My legs heavily dragged across the broken glass of the car window, ripping my jeans and slamming my legs into the frame. I knew it was real. The biting night sky whipped around me as I violently sank a few feet as the hooks in my shoulder began to slip. I experienced a new level of pain as I felt jagged talons piercing my side, and I folded forward as I was yanked backwards into the pitch. I felt another agonizing piercing on the side of my torso before being yanked up away from the earth and everything I'd ever known. I was pulled into the pitch past the streetlights, but whatever had me was struggling. I fell 20 feet onto the icy hard gravel path, but wasn't freed. Violent metallic screams flooded my ears, and the bones of my forehead and chin were scraped along the gravel path. I desperately clawed at the earth, trying to find anything to grip, but only found fistfuls of gravel and goose crap. The talons in my side ripped out suddenly, and I felt a sickening oozing from my sides. I tried to roll over to my knees, but the pain on each side was horrible, and I felt bile swelling in my throat. A patch of dirty snow was inches away, and I tried to crawl towards it to get some ice on my bleeding injuries. That was when I felt leathery whips on my face and violent snags in my hair, pulling and snapping. My stomach lurched as again I was yanked up into the night, higher into my own icy black death. I tried desperately to grasp onto whatever had me, terrified to fall as we climbed higher. The cold stung my raw shoulders and hips, and I felt my blood freezing. The deep scrapes on my knees and face burned with the wind, feeling like icy razors scraping my cheekbones. My numb fingers found a thick, velvety limb. Coarse hair bristled and slipping under my blood. 6 daggers dug into my skull and neck. Even over the roar of the wind and the pounding of the wings, I could hear a horrible scraping and squealing of claws on my skull from behind. From the inside. I struggled to breathe, blood and vomit filling my mouth and tears threatening to suffocate me. Suddenly, the little air that I had on my lungs was forced out violently as my midsection was slammed into the highest beam of the moon tower. The crunching of my ribs was unmistakable. My vision and even my own thoughts darkened with what I can only describe as wetness. Later, I would be told that my ribs were so violently broken that they had pierced my lungs. For a moment, the moon illuminated my nightmares. I was nauseatingly high up, one eye swollen shut, but I could see the frozen pond, dull and distant. Closer, I could see a row of houses, their windows glowing but cruelly out of each. One house still had its Christmas lights up, complete with a giant light-up plastic mold Santa Claus tied to their chimney. It felt wrong and cruel, a warm and happy impossibility. I looked down to see a stream of my blood pouring from my body in a steady flow, then broken by an aggressive gust of icy wind. I choked on a scream, and I was grabbed again, talons stretching out of the exit wound in my shoulder, birthing brand new ones on my lower back. I couldn't hear my own screams over the wind and the angry metallic shrieks like barbed wire on a rusted trampoline. I remember at this point, I could see the pond shrinking south of me as once again my host struggled with its prey. Suddenly we dropped right above the creek, my legs slamming into the fence surrounding the construction site. The cranes loomed over us, the two security floodlights at its base finally providing light. The construction site was deep in the ground, a parking garage with a basement level built to be tornado-proof. I've heard countless times from other people with violent experiences that they forget chunks of their trauma or they blacked it out. I try not to seethe with jealousy. If I could forget any of it, I would want to forget what I saw under those garish white construction lights. I can remember every tiny, ice-cold pebble digging into my skin, the shimmering bouquet of my tear-soaked lashes, the gritty, jagged pain of my pulverized rib bones. I remember the smell, a mix of cold sweat, like when our dad would come home after his jog, diesel, blood. There was another smell coming from the base of the crane, sickly sweet, like almond extract gone bad. Behind the crane was a trailer. The paneling was beige and a huge green tin sign that read, Argon Construction. I thought for a moment that a phone might be inside. I pulled myself up onto my knees and looked around. It was difficult since my left eye was useless, and my right one was full of tears and blood. My assailant was nowhere in sight. I thought that maybe it had gotten injured or caught on a fence. Stupid. I know now that it simply was rousing its companions, because it was dinner time. I was an offering, like when my cat Nala would bring me dead robins. Here I was, with my wings clipped. I was halfway to the trailer, limping as fast as I could, every step excruciating, breathing like there were pins and needles in me. Even with my sobbing hyperventilation, I heard it. I hear it now. I can always hear it. The two-toned whistle, haunting and dreadful, like even if I hadn't been at death's door, that tone would still have shaken me. Like a doomsday alarm, like useless sirens wailing as meteors crash into the boiling sea. Under the whistle, a thick, wet breath, echoing from beneath the base of the crane, a dark recess in the cold, wet ground, with darkness somehow leaking from it. Darkness so black that only a staccatoed stream was visible. Something was breathing. I wish I could tell you that the construction unearthed something ethereal, a beautiful sleeping giant, an angel, a groundbreaking discovery. But I don't even think it was the construction. I just think she'd always been there. Maybe for years she had survived on squirrels or deer. Maybe she thawed during the warm winter. Maybe she was left behind. The first thing I saw was the tattered, jagged tips of wings. Bat-like, narrow, dark-veined like bruised plum skin. Her pulse visibly pumping through the veins that raised and ripped through the paper-thin skin, stretching over her wings so tightly it seemed painful just to exist. Like she wasn't finished yet. Like she'd been birthed from the earth prematurely. And she was angry. Her hair was matted in clumps, but where it was free, it was long enough to drag along the ground. Slimy and cold and full of dirt, leaves and dirty snow. Her scalp was suffering. I could see her follicles piercing her scalp, like deceased plant roots, bulbous and swollen. Open sores at her hairline showed what I can only stomach to explain as insect activity. Layers of sick, sheer skin being actively eaten away by a miasma. Forehead wrinkles deep and scarred in places. She had no eyebrows or lashes that I could see from my crouched hiding position. Her nose was just a cavity, like a Halloween skull, also swarming with parasites. When she breathed in, a flap rippled across her face, the wetness dripping over her mouth. Her mouth! Years later, an art teacher had told me that while he enjoyed my monstrous horror drawings, that even special effects departments had boundaries, and I would be unlikely to get hired if I didn't tone it down or attempt to make them more realistic. If only he had known I was following his rules, drawing what I knew. She had the familiar sagging of a toothless old woman with flat, cracked, corpse-like lips, but then she parted them. The rot was dizzying. Her gums had been clawed away, scabs and scars and thick bands of roped grayish mauve flesh. Her top and bottom jawbones were not simply bared. They were jagged, layered razors, filed, but not with anything modern or sharp or particularly clean. Time, madness, desperation had filed and shaped that nightmare maw. Makeshift teeth of rocks had been maniacally shoved under the skin, adhered with infection and growth. The entire left side of her face was worn through layer by layer. Her tongue slipped in and out of what could have been her throat, sharp, gaunt collarbones literally piercing through that tissue-like skin, dark, rancid blood pooling in the deep recesses of her collar. She had one misshapen breast. The left side of her chest was deeply scarred and textured, as though it had been burned. Her fingers were bones with jagged talons blackened at the tips. Thick scar tissue marred her shoulders, where her wings took her from somewhat humanoid to monstrous. Scars everywhere. Rotting wounds dripping larvae and blood onto the frozen ground. I wish I could forget the momentary warmth I felt as urine poured down my legs, immediately freezing and burning, sticking my jeans to my raised and bloody shins. I tore myself away from staring at her long enough to escape. She had chosen her feeding place well. The deep recess of the site was the length of a football field, since that's what the field had once been. High walls of frozen earth surrounded us on three sides. Climbing up in my condition would be impossible. There was a ramp at the far entrance, but I wouldn't have made it past her. Only behind me was the fence I had slammed into on the way in, the creek only a few yards from that, and then a row of backyards of houses that included Dominic's. I had cried then. I cried thinking that only a few minutes away, my best friend was probably getting ready for bed. Then he would always remember the night before he woke up to find out his best friend was dead. He had no idea that my blood was spilling all over the place that we had run and played in. He was warm, with his own mom just feet away. I sobbed, thinking of my own mother. It wasn't the idea of her finding out too, or knowing I would never see her again. It was the guttural, instinctual, painful need for her. It was like being too far underwater and being out of breath, kicking as fast as you can, but knowing you couldn't make it. I needed her, but wouldn't make it to the surface. To her. My sobbing had given me away. That horrible metallic sound reverberated around me, and I remember I was being fed. She was feeding me to something. I had taken a deep breath, bracing myself for the pain, and made for the fence. Before my feet even hit the ground, her claws were in my neck. She flung me further from the trailer, and onto the fresh cement that had been poured during the warmer months. I gave up. I'll be honest. I accepted that I was going to die. Then I had heard something unexpected and sickening. Small, furtive movements. Unmistakable vocalizations. Even just from primal grunting and wet groans. I knew it was her young, and I knew it was human. I felt her toxic breath on me before I realized that she had moved. She paused for a second, mapping the wounds she had inflicted so that she could use them again as grips. That was when she dug in so deep into the opening in my shoulder that I could feel her nails and her fingers deep inside the wound. She flung me further across the cement, closer to the sickening, furtive movements. I squeezed my eyes shut. I smelled rancid organic decay and the unmistakable odor of feces. I felt small, fluttering fingers on my neck. Small, little, childlike. I made the inevitable mistake of opening my eyes. I saw dirty blonde hair, tinged with green, draped across a tiny face. Human feet. Baby feet. He was maybe 3, dirty and small. His fingernails were long and sharpened to points. He smiled, and thick mucus stretched across several blackened, sharp teeth. He was missing some, but what remained were crooked, stained and diseased, stuck in purple, rotten gums. Instead of chubby, rosy cheeks, he had hollow, sunken gray skin. The bags under his eyes were purple and veined. Instead of bright, youthful eyes, these were haunted orbs, devoid of color. Faded, milky irises deformed around dark, soulless pupils. He wore what had once been pajamas. Under layers of blood and grime, little trains chugged across his small body in a pattern. The sobs had returned from their hiding place in my chest. I had felt the need to comfort this small, broken doll of a child. That's when he lunged, his broken teeth sinking into my forearm. The pain was unbelievable, bright and loud like the headlights of a truck barreling down on you. I pulled away and heard a horrifying squelching sound as my forearm flesh ripped and hung from his tiny, plump lips. I gagged as he hungrily shoved my skin into his mouth. He ran to the monster, clinging to her body, his stubby hands sinking into her rotten fruit skin. I held my hand tightly against my forearm, watching the blood spill in tributaries between my fingers. It began to snow. Tiny, delicate laceworks fell into and melted against the steaming pool of blood at my feet. A disgusting gurgling sound brought me back, and I watched in horror as the little boy nursed from his mother's surviving breast. Thick blood spilled from the side of his mouth as she gently swept the hair from his face. Years later, I would look up the missing children's database online. I would narrow my search to my state, select the birth year, clumsily guess at the date missing, and it would take me 6 days and 2 breakdowns, but I would find him, along with an inaccurate age progression picture. His parents had named him Mason. He was a twin. He had a baby sister and a dog. He went missing from a family camping trip when he and his brother were 1. But I didn't know any of that when I watched him wash down my flesh with bloody breast milk from a demon I hadn't known existed a few hours earlier. Hours earlier, I'd been at the mall, for Christ's sake. The mall. With Charles. I guess remembering my brother's body hanging limply across the steering column had jarred me into action. Knowing he wasn't even a football field away from me got me moving. If I could get over the fence, I could make a beeline for Dominic's backyard. I would just have to jump over the mostly frozen creek to get there. Then I could run to his parents' window and have them call the police. I could see the yellow square in the dark that was the sliding glass door to their kitchen from where I was. If I ran through their house as a shortcut, I could run down their driveway, straight down my street to my house. My heart broke a little as I thought of my parents and my sister beginning to worry about us, as we were only a block away fighting for our lives. But if I got to the far end of the fence before the inclined up, I could get to Charles and keep him safe, keep him warm and talking until the ambulance arrived. Surely somebody had called. The impact on the car was so loud. The other driver surely had a car phone, or maybe a cell phone. Maybe even Yuki's Aikido puppy Moki had heard and was barking up a storm. Maybe the police were already there. For a moment, I thought about grabbing the boy, even if he bit me. I could carry him on my back and get him as far away from her as I could. Maybe even get him home to his family. But even as I stood there, I could barely hold myself up. The world had started to spin around me, blood thickly but steadily pooling on my shoes, my bra, and at the top of my jeans. A few feet from my right lay a rubble pile, not large, but mainly chunks of rebar and concrete. I'd barely made a few inches of progress towards it when a metallic screech again assaulted my senses. My hands covered my ears. I shuffled towards the pile and grabbed a chunk of the rubble, a crude, misshapen, and awkward hammer to wield against the impossible enemy. A rusted, twisted metal handle with a heavy and uneven weight of concrete, hard to hold and even harder to swing. But it was all I had, and I knew it only had to get to the weakest part of her. I only had to incapacitate her long enough to get within earshot of Dominic's house. It couldn't be much past 10 p.m. Someone would have to hear me. I gripped my shoddy weapon tightly to my chest with both hands and felt her swoop down violently as I dove for a cement tunnel, her empty-handed dive throwing her off balance. I scrambled awkwardly towards the far end of the tunnel as I heard her raspy wings pulling her upward before her second strike. Instead of waiting for her to cut me off at the tunnel, I ran as fast as I could, darting from the opening and towards the sickly sweet smell of her nest. The only thing between the fence and me was a bloody baby boy. Blood swirled in my mouth, and a gritty, sharp feeling forced me to spit. I don't know why the image of my tooth and my hand covered in blood triggered a response in me, but it did. I knew I was dying, not just that I was going to die, that this monster my parents had never imagined in their worst nightmares would take their daughter away forever, and they would never see my body or have anything to bury, but that I currently was actively dying. The damage to my ribs, my lungs, my spleen, my arm would kill me if the blood loss or hypothermia didn't do it first. I knew I was dying, and it turned me into a monster too. I ran, not straight for the fence, but for her nest. I could hear her above me, barreling down. I ran right towards that little boy and swung a 20-pound chunk of concrete down on his tiny hand, smashing it to the ground. The sound he made wakes me up at night sometimes. His screams were animal-like, and dropped my weapon to cover my ears. The rusted metal scream from the sky crashed down like a bomb, and I ran. I didn't look back. I ran to the fence. With all the strength I had left, I pulled myself up, shoving my foot into a diamond-shaped hole made by the chain link. I'd hopped 1,000 fences this way in my life, and to this day I'm grateful I had the experience. My bleeding hands found the frozen horizontal pipe at the top of the fence, and groaned in pain as I hefted myself over. All the fence-hopping experience in the world wouldn't have made climbing with shattered ribs and bleeding flanks any less impossible, and I could only crash to the ground. Both ankles jarred into the frozen ground, and my scream stuck in my throat, caught on blood and bile, escaping only as a choking sob. Her violent, crazed screams were still on the ground as she tended to her baby. I didn't let guilt slow me down. I ran as fast as I could for maybe 6 feet before my ankles gave out. Dominic's house was all I could see, a tunnel of black closing in on my vision. I never looked back. I gripped my fingers into the frosty ground, pulling myself up. I hobbled, sprinting towards the dark field. The night sky above me swirled with snow flurries. My busted, bloody fingers fumbled at my jacket zipper. I could see the flickering blue glow of the late-night TV coming from Mr. and Mrs. Rossi's bedroom. The tunnel grew smaller, and I could see less and less. Bawling, I forced my arms out of the jacket as I reached the banks of the creek. Dominic and I had spent summers of our childhood testing the width of the creek along its entirety, and I knew that the bend behind his house was not jumpable. My toes slipped over the crest of the land, and a razor-sharp talon slashed at my hands. I screamed and swung my jacket into the writhing storm of limbs and wings above me. Feeling solid impact on one of the swings, I let go of the jacket and flung myself across the frozen creek, landing with about a foot left, my feet crushing through the glass-thin ice as my ankles crumbled beneath me. I could only see a pinhole in front of me, a flickering blue of TV light. I could hear her above me, diving down, finally, for the kill. Her metallic scream and the deafening boom of Mr. Rossi's handgun, the one I'd never even known he had. He was standing on the back porch, one hand over his head, gun pointed to the sky. Mrs. Rossi stood next to me, Dominic's baseball hat in her hand. The last thing I saw was the golden warm glow of the Rossi's kitchen, and the pinhole closing as the world darkened around me. I've read the statement Mr. and Mrs. Rossi gave the police, that they heard what they thought were animal noises behind the house, but when they opened the back door, they heard human screams as well. They saw a large, dark shape in the night, but only a second later they saw my body slumped over, my fingers barely making it to their property. They had called 911, and then my parents. The ambulance had brought my brother and the other driver to the hospital, and it only arrived 30 minutes before mine did. My dad had run to the Rossi's house while my poor, confused, frantic mother rode to the hospital with Cammie and our neighbor. When my dad and I recently recalled the events of that night, I cried hearing the usual funny, goofy man choke up, remembering seeing me slumped over Mrs. Rossi like a rag doll, her white robe covered in my blood. He said that my face was so bruised and swollen that he thought an animal had mauled me. He wasn't exactly wrong. Mr. Rossi had stood guard with the bat until the police and EMTs arrived. Animal control didn't press me too hard. In fact, the vaguer and foggier my memory was, the happier they seemed. I knew that if I told the truth, I'd be locked up, medicated, or assumed to be a victim of something else. A monster woman from the sky. Before I could have even said it out loud, I knew better and feigned memory loss. To this day, the official story is 2 cars on Pondside were struck by a wild animal, and the passenger of one of the cars was attacked and dragged by the animal until a neighbor heard the commotion and fired a gun, scaring it off. While I was in the hospital, a handful of flowers, candles, and teddy bears were left at the stop sign. Charlie doesn't remember anything. He says the last thing he can recall is running to the car in the parking lot and turning the heat on, before pulling the car around for me. I'm actually happy this is the last thing that he remembers. I wonder if he's telling the truth, though. Cammie would come in my room at night for years. She would sit on the floor next to my bed with her fuzzy Disney blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She knew the whole story from beginning to end, even about Mason, a detail I had kept from my parents. Cam and I would stay up together until the sun came up, our eyes locked on the windows in my room, the one facing the south. Some nights, she would get in bed with me, both of us sitting with our backs against the wall, our shoulders resting on one another's, both of us looking at the window, scanning every inch of the blue-gray pitch until morning's first light, searching for a growing speck of black. My parents, proud pacifists, had purchased a gun each, and a few years later they had Cammie and I in judo classes. But the best thing they did was believe me. Even that first night, after the first surgery, they had listened intently, never interrupting or telling me I was imagining things or lying. However, it was made very clear that while our home was a safe space, we weren't to talk about it outside the walls. I know she's still out there. I know Mason is too. Even after I moved away, my mom would send newspaper articles, first clippings in the mail, then eventually links and text messages as time went on. Police blotters about animal attacks, missing dogs, unexplained accidents, missing blonde boys. She took one every few years, from different areas, and I thought initially maybe she had killed or eaten Mason once he was too old. until I saw them both one night. I'd heard the whistle, and I didn't even need to look up, but I did. But that's a story for another time. Sorry for posting this so late, but it took me a while to find somewhere I could hide, a place that no one else could get hurt. I first noticed the light one day when I was in school. I was working on a class assignment for math, struggling to figure out how to do a problem. All of a sudden, a light shone on my paper, illuminating my work. Usually our teacher kept the lights off in the classroom, only allowing small string lights to light up the room. But when I looked up, no one else had noticed the new lights turning on. That's when I realized that the light was coming from directly behind my head. I turned around to see it, but there was nothing there. Only a faint light coming from somewhere in the back of the room. I didn't pay much attention to it. I thought maybe it was something in the wall, a reflection, or even my mind playing tricks on me. It was a few days before I noticed it again. It was at night, and I had a friend over from school. Her name was Lana, and we'd been in school together ever since kindergarten. Life had gotten busier for both of us, so we didn't really get a chance to hang out much, at least not as much as we used to. Luckily today, we had a day off due to the snow, and since she lived close, she was able to come over. Today we were playing video games on Lana's new Switch that she got for her birthday. I didn't have one, and when I found out that she did, I was ecstatic to have her over. For hours into the night, we played various different games, including Mario Kart and Mario Party. I really liked Mario Kart, even though I wasn't as good as she was. Everything was going smoothly. During one game, I was really close to winning. I was right about to take a shortcut, which Lana had showed me, but right as I was about to make the jump, a flash of light illuminated the room, momentarily blinding me. What the hell?" I yelled out, throwing the controller down on the floor and rubbing my eyes. "What's wrong?" Lana had paused the game and was looking at me. The flash, it blinded me." I looked at the screen, noticing that my character had fallen over the edge of the map and was in the middle of being lifted back onto the track. So much for winning. "What flash?" I turned to her, twisting my head in confusion. Didn't you see that flash? It was so bright. It filled the whole room." I turned back towards the screen, but I could see a flash of concern on her face. We continued playing for another hour, but I couldn't really concentrate anymore. How could she not see it? Did she do that because she saw that I was winning? I shook my head at the thought. Her character had still been moving on the bottom of the screen, so I didn't know how she could use her phone to create a flash while I was playing. Plus, we were next to each other. I feel like I definitely would have noticed her. Lana excused herself to go to the bathroom, so I took my chance. I turned my head backwards slightly, trying to see if there was anything behind me. On the gray wall of my bedroom, there was a small yellow dot in the top corner. What was that? I strained my head, trying to get a better look. Was it a bug or something? It didn't seem to be moving at all. I was about to stand up to examine it further, but then Lana came back. We finished a few more games, but all I could think about was that dot on the wall. When she finally left, I stood up to inspect it. Each time I tried to touch it, the light would disappear, but when I removed my hand, there it would be again. I looked around my room, finding a piece of paper and a roll of tape. I folded the paper several times over and taped it over the wall. Satisfied that the light was completely covered, I got ready for bed and fell asleep pretty quick after. I woke up, rubbing my eyes. Had it already been morning? I grabbed my phone. It was 1:53 a.m. That's when I realized that the light wasn't coming from the window. In fact, it was still completely dark outside. I looked up above my bed. The light was shining through the paper and illuminating my bed. "Hey, honey, have you been feeling okay? You've been looking tired the past couple of days." I looked up to see my mom looking over at me from the opposite side of the table. "Yeah, Mom, I'm fine. Things are just getting a little busy at school." That was a lie, but otherwise I didn't know what else to say to her. How was I supposed to tell her that a mysterious light was following me wherever I went? No one else seemed to notice it. She didn't even seem to notice it now, with the light shining directly on her face. Okay, well, if there's anything I can do to help. Thanks, Mom. She grabbed our plates from the table, walking behind me to set them in the kitchen sink. I heard a gasp from behind her and turned to see her staring at the back of my neck, wide-eyed. What's wrong? She stepped forward, holding her hand out to touch my neck. It burned. Ow! What was that? I don't know, but have you been outside a lot recently? It looks like you have some sort of sunburn on the back of your neck. Sunburn? I reached around to the back of my neck, feeling the skin flake beneath my fingers. Was this from the light? It's not like I'd been outside recently, and even if I had been, the skies had been cloudy recently. There wasn't much sun this time of year. We should take you to a doctor right now. That burn looks really bad. I wanted to argue, but I didn't know what to say. Maybe the doctor would be able to help, or at least tell me that I wasn't crazy. The drive to the doctor took less than half an hour, and luckily not too many people were in the waiting room. When they finally called my name, my mom walked up to the front with me. I'll be right here when you come out. After the nurse brought me to the room, I felt the hair stand up on the back of my neck. Somehow I knew that the light was still with me. I didn't know how bright it was in the brightly lit doctor's room, but it was there. Hello, Jen. It's nice to see you today. How's everything going? Things are going pretty well. Your mom tells me that she's worried about some kind of rash or skin issue on the back of your neck. Can I take a look? I turned my head around so that the back of my neck was facing her. There it was. It's faint, but it was right there in the middle of the wall. As I felt her hands leave my neck, I turned back toward her. When did you first start noticing this happen? I don't know. Not until today, at least. Today? Were you outside a lot recently? I shook my head. Do you go to the tanning salon or something similar? I shook my head again. I wanted to tell him what was happening, but what if she didn't believe me? Or what if she thought I was crazy and had me sent away somewhere? I mean, looking at this, it's like a classic case of sunburn. Too much sunlight. I just don't understand how this would happen this time of year. She looked up from the clipboard, eyebrows raised at me. Do you have any other ideas about how this could be happening? I paused for a few minutes before finally deciding. I'm not sure, but I've been seeing this light. A light? Yeah, it started a few weeks ago, but there seems to be this bright light following me around. I've seen it on... Before I could finish, Dr. Paisley had pushed up from her seat and backed up against the wall. I stood there, holding my hands up towards her. What's going... You need to leave. Right now. Wait, but I thought... She had already opened the door and ran out of the room, leaving me standing, dumbfounded. What the hell was going on? I turned back to the light on the wall. It seemed even brighter now. After a few weeks of this, I started to learn to live with the light. Started wearing a scarf all the time to cover up the back of my neck, and whenever I slept, I always used an eye mask or covered my face with a pillow. It didn't completely block out the light, but it helped. I was walking towards the library. Lana and I were supposed to meet up to work on a group project for our history class, and we needed some extra time outside of school to meet. With the constant light on me and anything in front of me, I was having trouble working at a fast enough pace during class. I saw Lana sitting on the steps leading up to the library, typing away on her phone. It was hard to see her from this far, but I yelled out to her to get her attention. When she looked up, I gasped, dropping my phone and books to the ground. Her face looked different. The skin on her face looked red and inflamed, and some of it was even peeling off. She noticed that I stopped in the middle of the sidewalk and started to walk towards me. As she got closer, her facial features became even more visible, and it looked even worse than I first thought. A few feet away, and now I could see that the skin on her face had started to peel off enough that long flaps of skin were hanging off her cheek. Long flaps dragged down her forehead, partially covering her eyes. On her nose, I could see exposed bone. Hey, Jen, she smiled at me, waving her hand back and forth. How can she act as if everything was fine? Now that she was close up, the light behind my head shined even brighter on her face. I watched in horror as the flaps on her cheek peeled off. falling to the floor. Her gaze followed mine, and she looked down at the same spot where the skin had fallen. "What are you looking at?" She looked back up again, curiosity filling her face. Nothing. How are you doing? Are you feeling okay?" She looked from side to side, tightening the hood on her jacket around her face. "It's been getting a little too cold for me, but other than that, I'm okay. Are you ready to get this project started?" What was I supposed to do? Was this all part of my imagination? She seemed fine, even though she didn't look fine. "Yeah, sure." As we checked in at the front desk of the library, we made our way to one of the conference rooms in the back. I took out my notebook and my pencil, trying to ignore everything that was going on with my friend. I wanted to say something, but what was I supposed to say? "Hey, don't you notice your face is falling apart?" She would have thought I was crazy. Maybe I am. That would be the only thing that could explain what was happening. I blinked a few times, trying to read the information she was writing on the whiteboard. I think she was trying to schedule out what we should do next, but the intensity of the light was growing. The glare from the whiteboard blinded me, and I struggled to keep my eyes open. "Hey, are you okay?" Lana reached forward with her dried, inflamed arm. Now it was puffed up from all the light, and it was nearly twice the size it was before. I flinched from her touch. "If you're not feeling well, do you want to meet up another time instead?" I was about to decline when I saw her hand, and the rest of the room started to light up even brighter. Now the light was completely filling the entire room. Tears welled up in my eyes, and I couldn't see for a few seconds. When the light finally died down, I wiped my eyes with my sleeve. There Lana was, standing right in front of me. Her arm was reached forward, still, face twisted. But instead of her arm reaching out towards me, it looked like it had been ripped from her elbow. I screamed. Her wrist and hand were shriveled on the table, nearly burnt to a crisp. "Jen, what's going—" Before she could finish, I was already shoving my way out the door. I didn't even stop to say anything to the librarian, who had overheard the commotion from the conference room. I couldn't be around anyone right now. I ran all the way back to my house. I didn't want to stop. I couldn't stop. I didn't know what would happen if I did. The light started to shine brightly as I made my way through the rest of town. In my confusion and haste, I failed to notice an older man standing in the middle of the sidewalk. "Sorry," I yelled as I shoved my way past him. I heard him fall to the ground and heard a loud pop. I desperately wanted to turn back to see how he was doing, but I couldn't. I felt an arm grab me by the shoulder, twisting me around. A younger woman was glaring at me. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I turned back to see a small crowd had gathered around the old man on the floor. His cane had snapped in half, and he was grabbing at his hip. "I'm sorry, I really need to. Look at what you did. How can you be so reckless? Are you trying to run away like nothing happened?" I tried to jerk my arm away from her grasp, but her grip on me was too tight. "Please, I really need to." "No, you need to stay here and wait for the police. Someone's already called them, and they're on their way." "Please, you don't understand." The light started to get even brighter now, brighter than it had been in the library. When I could finally see again, I stared in horror with my mouth wide open. The woman and the people behind her were all gone. All that remained were the charred bones. The snow around them had melted, leaving the bones floating in a puddle of water. The only thing that remained at my feet were ashes. I brought my hand up to my face, and I couldn't stop them from shaking. They were reddened and burnt, but I couldn't feel any pain. I ran without stopping all the way back to my house. I didn't know where else to go, but I had to go somewhere where no one else would be. My mother used to tell me stories of sirens, specifically the sirens that lived in the lake near the lodge up in Fairbank that her family had owned for a long time. The lodge itself was a bit secluded, almost fully hidden behind an acre of forest. There was one road leading in and out, where the lodge and the lake sat. To be fair, the path we took was more dirt than road, and it was about a 20-minute drive to the nearest town. We went there every summer while I was growing up, and I always tried my best to search for the sirens my mother talked about. She told me time and time again that it was rare to catch such a supernatural sighting. But when the sky rains down and the winds are swift, you might be able to hear them. They sing above the whistle of the air, crying their blessing to the heavens above that water their lake, nourishing their home with its tears, she would say, her eyes glassy as she spoke, a small, serene smile playing over her lips, as if she was replaying a memory in her head. This, however, was not a satisfactory enough answer for an overly curious mind, and during every visit I would grab my scuba goggles and search the waters as much and as long as I could. I was never able to get too far down below the inky darkness was all that I could see, though, the deeper water far too out of reach from the sunlight above. My father, well, he had no time for such nonsense. He would roll his eyes and scoff any time Mother would begin her stories. It would make her brow crinkle, not at all happy with his mockery of the story passed down to her from her mother. However, as I grew older, so too did his annoyance with these so-called fairy tales my mother spun. He'd tell her I was getting too old to believe in such things, that her stories were nothing but bedtime tales for young children. This became one of the many arguments that they had throughout their marriage as time went on. As the years continued to go by, their relationship only seemed to get worse, and I was becoming aware of it quickly. There was always this tenseness that hung heavy in the air whenever they would be in the room together for too long. I would have been too young, but I wasn't blind or stupid. I didn't know exactly why their marriage was deteriorating, and I never thought to ask, as it seemed more like grown-up problems that I wouldn't be able to understand. Maybe over all those years, they had both just become different people, different than they had been when they'd first met, and they were no longer on the same page when it came to life goals. I don't know. Slowly, their disdain for each other became harder and harder to hide from me, though. I could sometimes hear them at night, fighting with each other in the late hours, hushed whispers laced with poison that would leak into my ears through the thin walls of the house. They never knew I listened, and I never said anything as they continued their charade, as if I couldn't see the cracks forming between them. That was another reason I loved the lodge. It was the only place that they never argued, either in front of me or in their room. It was our vacation away from the stresses of the monotony of life. Perhaps it was even a silent agreement between them. When they were at the lodge, they were happy. We were a happy family, or at least we pretended to be. And for a long time, I was okay with pretending we were happy too. The first time I saw a siren on the lake was the day before my mom died. She and Dad had gone for a hike through the forest up in the hills by the cliffs, and I had opted to stay behind. Maybe I'll take a look for sirens again, I joked. Although at 15, I'd given up looking for them a long time ago. I was growing up, after all, and despite my love of my mother's stories, even I was growing to doubt their validity. Dad sighed in annoyance, and Mom put a placating hand on his shoulder to try and ease his frustration. "Well, if you find one, I'd love to hear the story when we get back. We should be in well before the storm is supposed to be this evening," Mom had said with a grin. I waved them goodbye as they started their trek and watched them slowly disappear from view as they were swallowed up by the woods surrounding the lake. The sun had been above the trees when they had left. An hour later, when the storm began to quickly move in, they had not yet returned. I was starting to get worried. The wind had become a real tempest out there. I could hear the wailing gusts as they began to whistle over the lodge. The rain began to slap hard against the roof of the lodge as the downpour grew worse. The sky was growing even darker by the minute. I stood to watch at the window, looking for any signs of my parents. Then the lightning struck, lighting the entirety of the ground, yet still no sign of them. I went to the landline, but just as I picked up the phone, the power went out. I tried to phone anyway, but it was dead. My heart began to race, and I panicked, wondering what to do. I could go to the car, go for help in town. I didn't know how to drive, though, but I'd risk it. I knew the way to town, at least. I could get the police and round up a search party. With my mind made up, I grabbed my parka off the coat rack and Dad's keys from the other side, getting ready to face the onslaught of wind and rain that I was sure I'd be fighting every second on the way there. I was running down the front steps to the porch, towards Dad's car, when I first heard it. It made me stop, dead in my tracks, and I wondered for the briefest second if I was imagining things. High above the screaming wind, there was another sound, an ethereal, bell-like ringing dancing across the air. Or was that the sound of someone singing? I slowly turned towards the sound coming from the lake, my heart beating like a drum in my chest, my breath catching quickly in my throat. And there she was, the obsession of my childhood, the creature of the stories I had heard about for so long. I could see her, even through the darkness of the storm. She was above the water from the waist up, the rest of her body hidden below the shadows of the lake. The lightning scattered around the sky in quick succession, showing brief glimpses of the siren's full body in bits and pieces. Mother had said long ago that sirens were not the way they were in the storybooks. They were not beautiful maidens with long, shining hair and warm, supple skin. They looked like the creature before me now. She had no hair at all. Her head was bare and smooth like the rest of her from what I could see. She had chalk-white skin and black, beady eyes that stared me down as she sang. Her lips were thin and horrifyingly wide. She had 2 long rows of teeth that were white as bone, and every single one of them was sharply pointed, almost reminding me of a shark. I'd always expected to be excited if I ever caught a glimpse of a siren, despite being warned of their appearance. But this feeling that was creeping through me was like ice. That wasn't excitement. It was slow dread that was growing and pooling in my stomach as I stared, frozen in place by her song. A dull numbness began to set in, and the sound of the wind began to fade into the background, leaving nothing behind but the beautiful bell-like song. I could feel myself walking away from the car and towards the edge of the lake. I was caught by the bait of her song, and had gotten trapped in the dark abyss of her eyes. A siren's beauty does not come from her body alone. She sings to make you look, and when she catches your eye, that's what ensnares her human prey. Mother would say, snapping her fingers in my face. She would even eat me? I'd asked. Mother had shaken her head, smiling. No, my dear. Not these sirens, at least. Not the ones in our lake. These sirens are different. They will not harm someone of our family line, for we are the ones who brought them here so long ago. We're bound to each other, us and them. She would say that last part in a whisper, as if it was a secret. Maybe it was, as she never spoke about it again. But even now, even remembering her words, I felt a shiver of doom crackle through me as I got closer. The singing got louder, higher, shriller, until it was all I could hear. There was no wind, no rain, no thunder, just her song. I could see her better now as I trudged into the lake, my legs moving forward with a mind of their own. Her skin was like leather. I could see the gums around her white, jagged teeth, and they were all black as coal. Her fingers were long and thin, ending in black, sharp, needle-like points. She looked like my worst nightmare come to life, but still I couldn't pull myself away from her eyes. Her damn eyes. I wanted to scream. I wanted to cry, to run, but I was at the mercy of this thing. I guess it's true what they say. Be careful what you wish for. Her song stopped mid-note when I finally stepped within her reach. A long, spindly arm snapped out to grab my left wrist, and she lifted it to my line of sight before lifting her other hand and plunging a long black thumbnail into my wrist. Sirens can tell us the future, I remembered, my 10-year-old self asking with excitement. Mother hushed me, for it was long past bedtime, but I had begged for just one more fact that she knew about the sirens. Yes, and no. They can't see all, only bits and pieces that don't change no matter what we do or try to prevent it," Mother explained. I held on to that memory even as the shock of pain webbed up through my arm, through my chest, and then into my head. I could see it, what the siren had wanted to share with me, the reason she had called me into the darkness. I screamed, and then it was over. I don't know how long I sat there in the dirt and the mud, the water of the lake gently lapping around my waist as I stared out into the slow, waning storm. The wind had slowed, the rain had gentled, and with the chaos of Mother Nature's ever-changing mood slipping away from whence it came, the siren too disappeared with it, slipping back into the lake without a sound or a ripple, as if she had never been there at all. Heavy footsteps pulled me from my revelry, and I didn't need to turn to see it was my dad, nor did I need to look to know he was alone. When I finally turned to look up at that looming, soaking figure, his face was grim, and his hands were shaking. They'd lost track of the time and had gotten caught at the beginning of the storm. The darkness had overwhelmed them quickly, and even with their flashlights, it was a treacherous journey they had to make back down the trail as they came. Mother had walked a bit too close to the edge of a cliff, and the mud had given way under her steps. Then she fell. Just like that, she was gone. My father was quiet for a while after that. Even at her funeral, he was stoic and cold. I overheard some of the adults talking amongst themselves, telling each other how sad it was that she was gone, and how my father had to be strong for me. We didn't talk much after that day, and we didn't go back to the Fairbanks Lodge for a long time after that either. I never told him what I saw. I knew he'd never believe me anyway. I didn't go back again until I was 19. I took Mom's ashes with me, and I made sure to check the weather report on my app before I went. I waited and bided my time until I knew that it was just the right time. Then I called my dad. I told him I wanted us to spread Mom's ashes in the lake, and I wanted him to be here. He seemed resistant at first, but after a few minutes of begging, he relented. The wind was beginning to gust just as I saw the Jeep pulling up to the lodge. Rain was beginning to pour down harder when he got out. He was running up towards the porch in an attempt to escape the onslaught of the rain. When he stopped, he could hear it in the wind, the beginning of her song. I stood resolutely on the porch, making a point to avoid the view of the lake to my side. I saw him turn to look, and snap, he was snared. I watched him walk to the shoreline, and I watched him walk into the water. I watched until his head disappeared under the waves of the lake, following the heavy, dangerous voice and eyes of the creatures that lived below the darkness of the water. That day, the first day I ever saw a siren, my mom died, but not because she slipped. I know that because I know how she died. The siren showed me. She showed me how my parents began to fight on their hike, a fight bigger than I'd ever seen them have before. She showed me how in a fit of rage, my father had pushed my mother. He pushed her right off that cliff and to her death below, just as I now sent him to his death below. Like father, like daughter, I guess. I finally allowed myself to look towards the lake, my face devoid of emotion, and I saw her that one last time, the siren who snared me so long ago and had let me go. For I was bound to her, and she was bound to me, and she would not harm me, for it was my mother's blood. The same could not be said of my father. She gave me a subtle nod before disappearing beneath the waves again, leaving no evidence of either her or her visit, except the perfectly round white scar that I would bear on my left wrist until the day I met my end. I sighed as the storm continued to howl around me, creating a whistling sound as it ascended to the sky overlooking Fairbank Lodge. Or is that the sound of someone singing, perhaps?